Kia ora koutou katoa, ka mihi nui ki a koutou. My name's Nathan Wallace and welcome to the parenting segment of Papa Kāinga or Home Learning TV. We're looking at the parents of teenagers today, talking to you about how your teenagers are coping during the lockdown. So I've got to thank you first and foremost for your feedback, because that's been really helpful, really helps to know how to make this process as productive as possible for you. So thank you for that, keep it coming. What the feedback tells me really is that most of you are having a good time. I mean, even if a lot of it is tongue-in-cheek, admittedly, it seems to be mainly positive feedback. There are always, though, some families that are struggling. So in response to your feedback, today's topic is going to be around exactly that. How do we support people more? Not just people that are struggling, but support for everybody. It really is the more support you get, the more resilient you are. So let's go for it then. And looking at things like anxiety, depression, if those things are manifesting, what are the things that we can do to help minimise that? But first of all, let's take a look at why is it some children cope better than other children do? One of the most common questions I get asked is exactly that. Why, when they come from the same family with the same parents and the same rules, why is this one coping and that one not? So it might help to start there. Let's look at why do some children cope better than, say, other children. To help understand why some people cope better than others, I thought it would be helpful for you to understand what the literature refers to as the risk and resiliency spectrum. So if you can imagine, here's you in the middle. Risk factors are all the things that happen that make you more vulnerable. That's why I've chosen this little vase I got from China, because it's very, very delicate and so very, very vulnerable, but still utterly beautiful. So if you have enough of those risk factors accumulated, what are risk factors? They're things like poverty, a parent who's been to prison, a parent who was in foster care, a parent that hits you as a form of discipline, being isolated from your extended family like grandparents, being transient and moving schools, a whole lot. I mean, that's not an exhaustive list, but you get the idea. If you end up with enough of these stress factors, then you end up down this end where you are delicate and vulnerable. Alternatively, what we call the well-supported end, or supported well-being. So I've used two Egyptian pillars. I wanted two to represent that it is about the amount of support you get. So it's very much a whānau and connection concept, and the golden pillar just representing strength and well-being. So what are the things the literature tells us leads to strength and well-being and resilience? Often they're the opposite to that, but resiliency factors that we've got clear evidence for are things like having involved grandparents, having an at-home parent in the first year of life. Actually, the longer you have an at-home parent, probably the more steps you take. Speaking more than one language, that helps to change your brain. We're going to do a topic on that later, but it's very, very good for your overall brain health. Learning a musical instrument is actually very similar. Having high quality relationships with your teacher at school is another resiliency factor. You get the idea. Again, not an exhaustive list, but if you have enough of these resiliency factors, then you end up down here where we find in all the longitudinal studies, people that have enough of that support, they end up down this end. But this is associated with, not just good qualifications and good earnings and low imprisonment rates, but good mental health and good overall well-being. So the reason I wanted you to understand that is because I think it's an easy way to understand why some people who are already, say, in a single parent family, are isolated from their extended family. Maybe there's been some domestic violence in the family. Maybe they've moved recently to a new area so don't have social contacts. Maybe there's some diagnosis of mental health in the parent's history or the child's. So it's those accumulation of risk factors that actually makes the person vulnerable and delicate. It's not an inherent quality in the person so much, because if we add the appropriate supports to this person, if we give them support networks that they can reach out to, if we enhance their family networks, if we encourage the use of their own indigenous language or learning a second language, if we encourage them to play a musical instrument, if we maybe encourage them to have the same or go to a school where they have the same teacher for 2 or 3 years, so we have this high quality relationship. It's really our responsibility, not so much to blame this little golden orb for where they find themselves on the spectrum, but to support them to find things that we can do to add supports so they end up down here where we want everyone to be, in supported well-being. Kia ora whānau. So the genetics that the child brings to the party also has a role to play in that. It's just that it's not determined by that. People used to think the resilience resided entirely in the child, and what you're seeing from the last example is it's actually to do with how well supported that we are. But genes also play a role, so to explain that we might have to introduce a few more children to the family. So here we go. We've got an Egyptian, a Chinese, and an English. Yeah, come from my hometown where everyone's got different father. No, that's just a joke. So here we've got all the kids in the family, and genetically, even though they've got the same mum and dad, they don't actually get the same disposition towards, or genetic predisposition towards something like anxiety. We all get our own genes. So it might be that, you might have been born with a particular disposition towards being anxious genetically, right? But you're not the firstborn child. You've got an older sibling, and your older sibling, say this one, was firstborn, and they only have a little bit of a disposition towards, if this is the middle mark, they've only got a little bit of a genetic predisposition. We could say the other two children, this one won the genetic lotto and was born genetically way down this end, where they're really genetically predisposed to not have things like anxiety and depression, and this child's got quite a good predisposition towards good outcomes, but is not as much as the other sibling. So now what I want you to understand from this is that genes alone don't dictate. It's not going to be, the eldest child is slightly over the centre, so they're going to have a little bit of anxiety. This child, you, are going to have a lot of anxiety, and they're not going to experience anxiety, because genes don't dictate that outcome. That might be where our genes put us. You might have been down this end. Let's start with the eldest in this family, actually. This has a slight disposition towards anxiety and depression, but because she's the eldest, that's actually a huge leap forward. There's lots of advantages in being the firstborn child, all the extra attention that you receive in the first 1,000 days of life. That was what the 90s were about, really. Discovering your outcomes aren't determined by genes, but in fact a lot to do with the first 1,000 days of life. So, and this first child didn't have to share their caregiver in the first year of life, because that was mum's only kid. So that advantage puts them in the middle, and they don't ever develop an issue with anxiety and depression. And that's without considering all the other things that we talked about before, about this child might be bilingual and might have the same teacher at school for a 3-year period and has really involved grandparents, and so actually is well down that end, even though she started out with a disposition here. Same thing for you. You might not have been the firstborn child here, but maybe you had a particularly close relationship with your grandparents. Maybe you learned a musical instrument. Let's say you learned that musical instrument before the age of 7, started to learn before the age of 7, you get 2 steps for it, because the brain's just got so much more neuroplasticity at that early stage. You've got a particularly close relationship with a sports coach. Basically I'm trying to get you to see that even though you might have had quite a strong disposition towards that, you can add features that take you well up down this end. I also want you to understand that just because this child who's landed up down this end is not a guarantee that they're not going to suffer from anxiety and depression. No one remains stationary on that. This child might have been born with that predisposition, but if this child goes through, some sort of horrific childhood trauma, say there's a parent dies in a close member dies in their early care, for some reason they just happen to be born at the wrong time and the family are incredibly transient, for a period of their life, so they experience multiple schools and multiple educational settings. Say the grandparents die during the formative years. I don't want to load you down with all the trauma, but I'm just trying to get you to see that this child who was born here is not immune to anxiety and depression, because you put them under enough stresses and they will also end up down this end. So I'm just trying to get you to think about being supported well-being or being delicate and fragile. Yes, your genes play a role in that, but really we can't change your genes. What we can change is the amount of support that we give the individual, so that we can move them down to this end of being well-supported well-being. Kia ora whanau. So, what are those things that take our child down the well-supported end of the spectrum, rather than the spectrum or the end of the spectrum that puts them at risk? I think a lot of it is if you just remember the mantra with and not to. It's about co-constructing things with teenagers. If we're just constantly telling them, you must do this, the research doesn't support that result, it doesn't support that approach, because it doesn't get a good result. Some of it's just reinforcing the messages that we've reinforced already. I mean, it is really important that your teenager be getting regular movement, because they need those endorphins for their brain. It is really important they get the right amount of sunlight on their eyes, because that helps to set their circadian rhythm, and how much sleep you have is really fundamental to your mental health and well-being. It's no different from when they were little babies, and if they were hungry or they were tired, they went downhill. So it's just the same with teenagers. It's much harder to regulate their sleep now. But if you help them with those, give them jobs, gives them a sense of purpose around the home, and it also helps to give them a little bit of structure, because if they have agreed that they're cooking tea every second night, then they sort of have to be in the kitchen at 3. It's really about leading a balanced lifestyle. So another reminder too that it's going to be very helpful to your teenager's mental health to have some regular device-free time every day. That's part of that balanced lifestyle. And if they know that there's a certain amount of time every day where they don't have a device, then they're more likely to get up and do the physical exercise, interact with other family members, the things we know that is really good for their brain and does help with their mental health. The good thing about having slightly older children is you don't need to be the only one telling them this message. Encourage them to look up the World Health Organization online, because that gives a whole lot of recommendations for young people in maintaining good mental health. And also encourage them to check out the Ministry of Health here in New Zealand, because they're giving similar guidelines, tips and strategies. That way it's not just you telling the teenager this is what's good for them, you're reinforced by, you've got backup from the experts as well. Okay, for the actual really anxious child, what are we going to do for them? Some of it is just reinforcing the messages that we've talked about already. Like, can't stress enough the importance of exercise. We talked yesterday about the endorphins and how important those endorphins are to the mental health and well-being of your child, so encourage them to be getting regular exercise. Like I say, even if that means taking out the wheelie bins as much as you can get them to do, at least it's something. The literature talks about the mailbox effect now, how just walking to the mailbox to check the mail and walking back again releases enough endorphins in your brain to change your mindset. So encourage that movement. If they are having trouble getting out of bed, then maybe help them build a daily routine that involves them doing a job that they have to have done by 11 so that they are up, and that helps to support them to have a routine. They can still decide what is the rest of their routine and their rhythm for the day, but you're putting in place some basic structures to help get that started. But just basically remember with and not to, those are your key words. Actually, if I was going to give you one catchphrase to understand how to deal with really anxious children, I would say high expectations, high nurture. So it's not about having high expectations and not helping and supporting them. And it's not really about so much dropping your expectations. Yes, when people are under stress, it's quite normal to regress a little bit, but it's also important that you have the expectations that yes, they will be asleep by a certain time, and yes, they will get up by a certain time, and yes, they will shower regularly. Still have to keep up high expectations, but you do that with high nurturance. So it's okay to look after them if they're a bit stressed out. If they're not coping very well, then you making them a cup of Milo or running them a bath can make a world of difference to making them feel supported. So don't be scared to give the kids extra nurturing, but don't drop those expectations. High expectations, high nurturing. So we've found some resources, some online things that might be helpful here, but I'd encourage you to find your own too. And if you find wonderful suggestions, then please feel free to share them. Just go to nathanwallace.com, scroll down, go to my Facebook page, post it there. That's how I'm gathering all of the information. What we did find is a great resource called Get Out of Your Mind and Into Your Life for Teens. So just go into Google and search, you'll be able to find that. There is the 1737 line, which is always available for help, so don't be scared to ask for help, and that's the way that you can access help, through 1737. One I like is Auntie D, a bit more general advice, but I encourage you to check that out. That's at www.auntied.co.nz. One of our other ones we've got here, thelowdown.co.nz. There's some excellent resources on there. One called Sparks, S-P-A-R-X. So just go to sparks.org.nz. And like I say, if you've got any that you want to contribute, then please feel free to send them in. So again, thanks for your support, and keep the ideas flowing. And remember, as always, stay safe, stay well, and stay connected. Kia ora koutou, ka mihi nui kia koutou.